We are going to talk today about how the Islamic caliphates, the Umayyad and the Abbasid caliphates, dealt with the non-Muslims within their territory. I want to first make a note that the conversion to Islam of people within the Islamic caliphate, and here's how the Islamic world would spread, okay, from various centuries. As the Islamic world would spread, please understand that there was no compulsory conversion, no forced conversions, or let's try not to work in too many absolutes here. For the most part, there weren't compulsory conversions to Islam. In fact, in the earliest days of the expansion of Islam, the Arabs who were spreading and growing this caliphate, in fact, didn't have it as their goal to convert everybody that they came across. Because once you converted people, there were things you weren't necessarily able to do with them. For example, you couldn't take slaves that were Muslims. There were taxes that non-Muslims would be required to pay, and you would lose those. So it would actually, even though the Islamic caliphate would spread very rapidly, and so like, this is the Umayyad dynasty. All of this purple stuff, pink, I don't know, whatever color that is, all of this stuff is going to be within the first century of the expansion of Islam. But the majority of people that they're going to be conquering aren't going to be Muslims. It won't be until about 1200 that a majority of the Islamic world becomes actually Islamic. All right? It takes a lot of time. And now we would look at much of this part of the world, and it's predominantly Muslim, almost 100% in some places, 100% in some places. But that wasn't true from the very start. These people that the Islamic world is going to come in contact with that are not Muslims, if they're Christians and Jews, they are referred to as a DME population, DHIMMI. DME population. The DME population are the Christians and Jews, or what is sometimes referred to as the people of the book of the Islamic world. They belong to the same monotheistic tradition that Islam belongs to. And because of that, the DME populations would receive special treatment compared to other individuals who weren't Christians or Jews, or certainly Muslims. For example, if you were some kind of paganist or polytheist or something, you could meet the sword right away. There was nothing stopping anybody from persecution or ultimately execution if you did not convert. Whereas the Jews and the Christians, they were a protected class. They weren't expelled, they were tolerated. Now, we want to be very careful here, because we talk a lot about toleration and tolerating people and tolerance in school. And we start to think that tolerance becomes like a really good thing, like to be tolerant. We want everybody to be tolerant and to like accept those around them. But to tolerate is a pretty low bar, right? Like we tolerate things that we often don't like or we don't care for. We put up with them. And that's ultimately what the DME population ended up being. It was a tolerated, protected class. They did not enjoy equal status within the community. There were some discriminations against this class, but there weren't executions or forced conversions they weren't expulsions. They weren't driven out of the community. And we want to also note that this Islamic world is very big. All right? There are a lot of people, and there are a lot of corners and nooks and crannies of what is known as the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. It's massive. And I'm going to talk today in broad generalities, all right? This is not to say that every single community would have been running in the exact same way. Some areas would have been seen as more modern and cosmopolitan. Some areas would have been a little bit more strict and conservative in the way they might have run. So in general terms, DME populations were a tolerated class, a protected class, but there might be some discriminations that they would deal with. And I think you guys read about some of these. There could be higher taxes. You guys might remember from 9th grade AP World that jizya tax that the Christians and Jews would be responsible for paying that would not be compulsory for Muslims to pay. In areas, Christians and Jews would not be permitted to carry a sidearm, a weapon, a sword, disarming these populations essentially. Along the same lines, in some places they weren't permitted to ride horses, because horses are, in a sense, a military weapon. It's going to elevate you in society. It's going to allow you to move faster, certainly, but that could also be militarily threatening. They weren't allowed to take Islamic names, and they would maybe be forced in some areas to wear distinctive dress to, like, segregate them from the Muslim community. I think this one's kind of interesting because we see a little bit of a mirror of this in our modern society, certainly in our community. In some communities, the churches in town that had long predated the arrival of Islam, they would not be allowed to play their church bells. All right? So like maybe on the hour or whenever the church bells would be played, they might be forbidden from doing that, which is kind of interesting. You don't have to go too far back in the history of our community when there was a lot of protests in Hamtramck, for example, when a mosque would issue the call to prayer over loudspeakers, and non-Muslims in the community found that very offensive. But ultimately it was ruled that no, that can happen. And so in some ways we still deal with some of these questions. Churches, sometimes new church construction or new synagogue construction was not permitted. A synagogue is a Jewish house of worship. Or if they were going to be churches that were built, that they could not stand taller than the mosque in town. To basically just place Islam at a higher plane. And that's what all these things do. With all that said, though, for Jews in particular, if you had a choice, if you were Jewish and had a choice of living in maybe what is known as Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, Islamic Iberia, if you had a choice to live in a city like Cordoba on the Iberian Peninsula when it was ruled by an Islamic state, or to live in Paris, or to live in London, or to live in Munich, Germany, or Vienna, Austria, or in Venice in Italy, you would much rather choose to live the life of the Jews in the Islamic world. Because in the Christian world, there were serious persecutions of the Jews, serious segregations of Jewish communities. The word ghetto, that you guys are all familiar with today, is an Italian word that was used for the segment of a city that the Jews of Venice, for example, were allowed to live in. All right? There were occupations that were not open to you if you were Jewish in Europe. There were, of course, areas of cities that you were not permitted to live in. There were absolute pogroms and violence against Jews in Europe. And it was not a pretty situation. You guys might remember that classic ditty from your childhood. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You remember this, right? There's a little known, made up by me, addition to that poem that we don't teach kids. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. In the same year, in 1492, Spain expelled the Muslims. This is the year of the Reconquista. This is the final year of the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. Spain expelled the Muslims, but not just their Muslim population, but also their Jewish population. In 1492, Spain expelled the Muslims and the Jews from Iberia. So, if you were a Jewish person in the Middle Ages, you would have fared far better in the Islamic world than you would have in Christian Europe. All right? And so that, I think, hits home that idea that this Arab-Israeli conflict is not something that we can date back centuries before. It's newer in its construct. All right, we're going to talk briefly about the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is one of these classical civilizations, right, or classic civilizations of world history. The Ottoman Empire is born in the 1300s in eastern Anatolia. Now, this map is kind of weird looking at because you can hardly make out Europe up here. It's Mediterranean Sea, Africa, Europe, and then all of the colored regions here. That's the Ottoman Empire. The extent of the Ottoman Empire at its greatest, with its greatest reach. So the Ottoman Empire is born in eastern Anatolia. It's actually originally led by a guy named Osman, and that's where Ottoman comes from. The Ottoman Empire is born in the 1300s, and from there it's going to expand. You guys first really started hearing about the Ottoman Empire back in AP World a couple years ago when in 1453 the Ottoman Empire conquered the city of Constantinople. right? And that brought an end, basically, to the Byzantine Empire. The Ottoman Empire is going to continue to expand from there. In 1517, the Ottoman Empire is on the gates of Vienna, Austria. So they're pushing all the way through southeastern Europe, nearly into Vienna, Austria, when their armies are held back and they sign an agreement. But you notice, this Balkan Peninsula comes under the control of the Ottoman Empire. All right? The Ottoman Empire is an Islamic empire, to be sure. There's Sunni Muslims in the Ottoman. The Ottoman Empire saw themselves as the Islamic caliphate, essentially. Even though they're not using the word caliphate anymore, they saw themselves as the Islamic state on earth here. And the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was at once a political leader and a religious leader within the Ottoman world. Now, the Ottoman Empire has a dramatic and fast rise to power. But as we get into the 1500s and as we push deeper into the 1500s, the Ottoman Empire will already begin what becomes a long and slow decline. And that happens because of what's going on in Western Europe. Prior to the 1500s, if you were a European and you wanted to get your hands on some wealthy, luxury Asian goods, some spices and silks coming out of Asia, you had to do business with the Ottoman Empire. Because the Ottoman Empire controlled the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire controlled the trade routes connecting you to the Asian world. If you were Italian merchants, you would have to make your way to the Eastern Mediterranean and then start dealing with the Ottoman Empire before you got yourself into the Red Sea and into India. All right? But then around the year 1500, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's a good year to remember. Around this same time that we're seeing the high point of the Ottoman world, the Europeans are going to be going through some serious changes. Western Europeans, starting with the Portuguese and the Spanish. And the Portuguese and the Spanish, there's a reason why they're the ones that do this first. All right? They're smack dab on the Iberian Peninsula, right on the water. All right? They've got the easy access to seaports. But they also were a part of a tradition that drove in Iberia, that drove the Muslims out of Spain and out of Portugal. They successfully completed the Reconquista. And so they feel, the Portuguese and the Spanish feel, that they're like on the front lines of the defense of the Roman Catholic Church, which needs a lot of defending around this time period. In 1517, also another thing going on at this time, Martin Luther is starting the Protestant Reformation of the Roman Catholic Church. So Roman Catholicism needs a lot of defense. And these people in Iberia, they have a particular hatred for Muslims, because it was Muslims that took their land from them back in the 700s, that they only recently regained. So if these guys could find a way to avoid the Islamic Ottoman Empire as a middleman, because every time trade is going through the Ottoman Empire, you got to pay the Ottoman Empire taxes and tolls. If they could find a way to avoid that, that would be 2 thumbs up for Spain and Portugal, and 2 thumbs up for Roman Catholicism. Portugal does it first. They skirt around the coast of Africa. A guy named Bartolomeo Diaz in the end of the 1400s says, hey, you can get around Africa. That's cool. Let me go back up and tell everybody. And then later, Vasco da Gama finishes the deal and goes all the way around Africa to get into India. Around the same time, since Portugal already had a market on going around Africa, this is when Spain gives an Italian guy, Christopher Columbus, some money and resources to head west in hopes of getting east. And the idea is not just to get to the riches of the east. That's what we teach you in elementary school, because we can't keep it real for 5th graders, right? We say, hey, they want to go to the east to have a faster way to get to the west, or go to the west to get to the east faster. No. They want to go to the west or go around Africa, not just because it might be faster, but because it avoids paying taxes and tolls to Muslims, because the Spaniards and the Portuguese did not want to do business with the Ottoman Empire. So as you get more and more trade avoiding the Ottoman Empire, as you get more and more trade avoiding the Ottoman Empire, you get a weakening Ottoman Empire. All right? This is happening at the same time as some other advancements in Western Europe that are going to speed up this development of Western Europe at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. The rise of capitalism. All right? The rise of capitalism. Of a banking industry and an insurance industry, new financial instruments that are going to make it easier for Western European powers to finance these trade expeditions. All right? Banking is important because we don't always have the money to do what we want to do today, so we need a bank to provide us loans. Ironically enough, a lot of the banks are being controlled by Jews in the late Middle Ages and early 1600s. They're controlled by Jews. And one side note to the story, because Jews, not reading the Old Testament or the New Testament of the Bible, have no prohibition against what Christ called usury, against charging interest on loans, right? What would Jesus do if you needed $10? He would give you $10 if he had it. He wouldn't give you $10 and charge you 10% interest. Well, the Jews weren't reading that part of the Bible, so they could charge interest on loans. So many Jews got involved in banking industries in Western Europe, which was necessity. It was needed to propel this modern age, but we never like the bankers, right? We need the bankers. We always wish they would charge us lower rates, though. So we don't always like them. We feel they are holding back on us. So the rise of a banking industry, the rise of an insurance industry. Insurance is huge. You guys drive your cars to school, some of you. Do you realize you're driving like a $20,000, some of you even more, $20,000 piece of machinery on a road amidst other people driving $20,000 plus dollar pieces of machinery? And if you get into a wreck, you could, in a heartbeat, lose $20,000 in value. That's mental. No one would do it unless you insure it. Unless you know that if something catastrophic happens, if your car gets destroyed, an insurance company will replace it. That makes us comfortable buying things like cars that are wildly expensive. Or homes! My gosh, my house! $250,000 house with a strike of lightning could go up in flames or down in flames. What's that? Okay, yeah, we'll watch that. I don't know. No, I don't think there's any connection there. But anyway, with a bolt of lightning, my house could burn to the ground. Who would ever buy a house if you knew that a $200,000, $300,000 investment, $100,000 investment could be gone with one lightning bolt, right? Or one accident in the house? That would be a disaster. But we insure our homes. And it makes me, I don't freak out when there's a lightning storm. In fact, I'm like, yeah, that would really suck, but man, then I'd get all new stuff, Insurance is a cool thing. 3 things I would grab. Well, not including my kids or my dog. But grab my computer, because that's got all the pictures on it, because who would want to lose those? Grab my computer, and grab my wallet would be a good thing to have. Yeah. Because that's all I have to grab. Yeah, the hard drive. Grab the hard drive.
Birth certificates.
Yeah. You can replace those things. But you can't replace your pictures. You gotta get the pictures. I should put, they're not all in the cloud. I should put them all in the cloud. Good call. Anyway, we press on. The development of insurance agencies in Western Europe, it's going to make a lot of Western European companies say, hey, we would have never otherwise put this ship on the open seas that could very easily sink. We would never do it unless our investment was insured. So that's huge. We get the birth of joint stock companies in Western Europe. These companies where investors from around the community can put money into without the fear that they would lose their entire livelihood if that company started to lose business or actually even went under. So we get that. And then we get the growth of military power. Because as Britain and France and the Netherlands and Portugal and Spain are all in competition with each other for these trade markets, they're all making better warships. And actually, many of their merchant ships are, at the same time, warships. They're making better warships. They're making better cannon. They're figuring out how to get from point A to point B even faster. The iPhone is better today because it's in competition with Samsung. And Samsung phones are better today because they're in competition with Apple, right? British ships were better because they were in competition with Dutch ships. And Dutch ships were better because they were in competition with British ships. And if the Dutch ever came up with something new, the British would copy it. And if the British ever came up with something new and that was worthwhile, the Dutch would copy it. What's that? this is, I think, predating a lot of that, and that's going outside. Like, we don't have any kind of international patent law that's protecting anything at this age. And even same thing today. There's a lot of patents on Apple products, but there's a lot of, well, and then we have court cases to decide where that is, or even just other third-party companies that are ripping off these ideas from people today. So anyway, we get a tremendous growth in Western Europe. At the exact same time, we have the Ottoman Empire in slow decline. All right? Britain, especially, begins to use this strength that they are going to grow. And they're going to use the weakness of the Ottoman Empire. It's all happening simultaneously to make the British Empire stronger. The British Empire will be the biggest empire on the planet in the 19th century. This is where we say the sun never sets on the British Empire, right? Because literally at any point in the day, the sun is above some area that the British crown has staked its claim. Whether it be in Africa, where they had an unbroken band of territories, colonies, from Egypt all the way down to South Africa. Whether it be in the Americas, first with us, then we bail, but Canada's still there. Over into Asia, Australia, into South Asia, in India. India will be the crown jewel of all of these colonies. India becomes the most important of all of these colonies for England. And this is happening at the exact same time as another development in Western Europe called the Industrial Revolution. Around about 1750. Guy's going to invent a steam engine in England. And we're going to start using steam power to power factories. All right? And we're going to have a growth of a factory class. And we're going to see mass production in England. Starts in England, spreads to Europe from there. And as England begins to produce more, and as so much is being driven by steam power, you need more resources. Coal to boil the water, to make the steam. And as we start to mechanize factories to produce things like clothing, textiles, you're going to need more and more cotton than you ever could have needed before. And as you need more cotton, Britain's got to have places to get that cotton from. You're going to get a lot of it from the United States. But in the mid-1800s, the United States starts to have a civil war that slows down cotton exports from the South. So Britain will become even more reliant on India for Indian cotton and Egypt for Egyptian cotton. Now, that's all well and good, but if you're England and you got to get cotton from India, you've got a long trip around Africa to get there. All right? And that's time-consuming, and that's expensive. Well, the Ottoman Empire in the late 1800s controls Egypt. And Britain wants in on that. And Britain will start and support what is originally an occupation of Egypt, but eventually they begin to control Egypt outright. Because Egypt gives Britain a control of what is known as the Suez region. We talked the other day about the Suez Gulf, the Gulf of Suez, where in 1869 the Suez Canal will be dug, which will give a waterway access from the Mediterranean Sea through the Gulf of Suez into the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. So now when British traders, instead of having to go around Africa, they can now cut that route more than in half, going through the Mediterranean, going through the Suez, and getting into India. And it is dramatically shortening the time it takes to get goods to factories of England and then finished products to markets back in India. And this is huge. Britain will begin to dominate a relationship with the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire needs this. It's getting something out of Britain. Britain finally cares about the Ottoman again. But Britain will begin to force upon the Ottoman Empire what are known as a series of capitulations. Like the Ottoman Empire actually having to give in to British demands and for unfair treaties. For example, if you were a Briton in the late 1800s and you commit a crime, B-R-I-T-O-N, you're a British person in the Ottoman Empire. You commit a crime in the Ottoman Empire. You would be put on trial by a British court, not by an Ottoman court. This is like really showing how weak and how little control over their state, at least aspects of their state, the Ottoman Empire actually had. Well, the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century would see the writing on the wall. They would see that this relationship is not tenable. They see the rise of Western Europe at the same time as their own demise. So in 1839, the Ottoman Empire would usher in a period known as Tanzimat. Tanzimat. It's from 1839. And it lasts all the way to 1878. It comes from a word that means imposing order, bringing order to the Ottoman Empire. We talked about these in 9th grade, or 10th grade probably, the Tanzimat reforms. That might ring a bell to you from AP World times. And this would be a series of reforms in the Ottoman Empire doing two things at the same time. One, it's the Ottoman Sultan trying to regain control of his state, trying to centralize power in the Ottoman Empire. And two, trying to stand up and be more like those Western European powers. Be more westernized, because it's going to make you stronger and it's going to ultimately make the Sultan stronger. So there's going to be a whole series of reforms during the Tanzimat era. There's going to be military reforms, and Western-style military academies will be built. There's going to be a centralization of the Ottoman Empire, bringing more of a bureaucratic state to the Ottoman, kind of like Western European states were running. They're going to adopt European-style clothing. If we look at this picture here, except for the fez, they hold on to the fez, but European-style uniforms and clothing will be adopted in the Ottoman Empire. In 1839, the Sultan is proclaimed as, of course, the ruler of all people in the Ottoman, but not just Muslims. All right? Even though the Sultan has long been the leader, seen as the leader of the Islamic state within the Ottoman Empire, in 1839, the Ottoman Sultan says, I am not just the ruler for my Muslim population, non-Muslims as well. And non-Muslims will be protected within the Ottoman Empire. In 1856, as a part of these Tanzimat reforms, there's an equality code that is passed where all subjects of the Ottoman Empire, regardless of ethnic nationality, because look at how big the Ottoman Empire got, guys. Remember, the Ottoman Empire is huge. We've got to go back to here. The Ottoman Empire is huge. You got all kinds of different people living within the Ottoman Empire, right? North Africans and Arabs and Europeans and Turks themselves, all living within the Ottoman Empire. In 1856, the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan says, you are all equal before the law. All right? So all of those discriminations that Jews and Christians might have previously dealt with within the Islamic Caliphate, those will now be eliminated. Those will now be eliminated. Yes, sir?
Was that a part of the Ottomans winning the Crimean War in 1856?
This is a part of the Tanzimat reforms that begin a little earlier than that, but then the Crimean War helps that along, certainly. Crimean War in the 1850s, the British and the French are going to support the Ottomans in fighting against the Russians. Confusing, it's not crucial for our story. But it does propel the Ottoman Empire to have a more Western-style military and state. We begin to see non-Muslims, some Christians, some Jews, entering the government within the Ottoman Empire. A new constitution with a parliament is created. A sense of Ottoman nationalism is going to be born. Like trying to say, hey, you Arabs, or hey, you North Africans, we're not different. We're all Ottoman now. This can transcend our ethnic differences. All right? Trying to bring everybody together, and like what we would say is how we try to think of Americans today, right? That America should transcend the ethnicities that make up America. So, yay! A secular court system. No longer would there be a court ruled by Sharia law within the Ottoman Empire, but it would now be a secular court system. This image that you guys see here is an Ottoman woman being freed from the chains that would have bound Ottoman women prior to these Tanzimat reforms. They're freeing her symbolically to be a new and modern woman within the Ottoman Empire. But the most important reform of Tanzimat for our story here comes in two land codes First in 1858, and then in 1867. With the land codes in the Ottoman Empire, land will become a commodity. Rather than all of the lands of the Ottoman being the Sultan's land, the Ottoman Empire and the Sultan needs a more efficient way to collect taxes. And he doesn't want to rely on the traditional landlords throughout the empire. He needs a more efficient way to collect taxes. So with the land codes of the Ottoman Empire during the Tanzimat era, with the land codes, land will be divvied up. And if you've been living on your land, if you've been working your land, you will be deeded that land. You will get a piece of paper that says, this land is your land. We will commoditize land. We're going to turn land in the Ottoman Empire, not as a sultan's domain anymore, but now as privately owned land. And if you privately own your land, what can you do with it? You can sell it if you want. You've got something now that is of value. You have a deed to your land, and you now are free to sell that land if you want. So for various reasons, over the next 40 years, some people throughout the Ottoman Empire will decide to sell their land. Maybe they don't want to own land anymore. Maybe they want to move to a different part of the empire. Maybe they fall on hard times or bad luck, and they need some quick resources fast, quick cash fast. So they sell their land. And we begin to see, after these land codes, the growth of a wealthy landowning class that owns the deeds to these land within the Ottoman Empire. And now we can think of them more in the terms of not like medieval landlords, but modern landlords that own houses that people rent out or apartments that people rent out, right? And maybe people in Palestine, this brings us to our story, maybe people in Palestine start to sell their land. And people outside of Palestine might be buying it because they might see it as a viable investment. Just like today, there's people in Michigan that buy property down in Florida because they hope that it's one day going to rise in value. And so we have now a class of absentee landowners. They're known in the Ottoman Empire as the notables. A wealthy class that begins to amass a lot of property now that property can be bought and sold. They begin to buy property. And they might not even live in Palestine. They might live in Istanbul. They might live in Paris. But it doesn't matter where you live. You can own property on the other side of the planet today. It doesn't matter where you live, as long as you got the deed to that property. And the people of Palestine can keep living on their land, but now they're living as renters rather than as owners. All right? And this is going to become hugely important to our story as a new group of people in the 19th century is going to look to buy land in Palestine. Because nobody had been looking to move to Palestine. Did I read the quote the other day from Mark Twain, what he had to say about Palestine in the 19th century? Nobody was wanting to move to Palestine in the 19th century until persecution of Jews in Russia starts to ramp up and some Jews begin to look for a new homeland. Then there will be a push to buy land in Palestine when no one else had wanted to buy land in Palestine. And there's going to be willing sellers of that land. Good? Good.